Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete. Today I'm going to be talking about the 10 worst mistakes that natural lifters make when they get into bodybuilding. And these are going to be mistakes that I made as a beginner. There's a quote by Otto von Bismarck that says, "Only the fool learns from his own mistakes. The wise man learns from the mistakes of others." So today I'm going to be sharing some of the mistakes that I've made throughout my training career that you can avoid for optimal hypertrophy. These are going to cover the spectrum of training, diet, and recovery. One of the early mistakes I made when I got into lifting was training too hard. There's this blood and guts attitude in bodybuilding where people want to push themselves to the extreme with every workout. But the thing is, there is an optimal stimulus for each person at a certain point in their training career. You can look at stimulus as being created by the different variables of frequency, intensity, and training volume. These variables come together to give you the stimulus, but the thing is, they impact each other. So for example, when you increase intensity, you will have to decrease volume. When you increase volume, at some point you're ideally going to want to increase frequency. And if you're training really intensely, you may need to back off on the frequency because of soreness. Now, each lifter is going to have an optimal combination of these that's going to give them their best stimulus. This is something you'll have to find out for yourself, but the key is that more is not always better. When I started out, I remember taking all sets to failure, which actually isn't necessarily a bad thing if you're really short on time, or if you're one of those athletes that does really well with high intensity, low volume training. However, for the majority of lifters who have enough time to get in enough volume, this is often not necessary. And if you are training too much, you will run into suboptimal gains. It will also lead you to the next point, ignoring aches and pains. This is a mistake that I made starting out, where particularly I love the bench press, and I remember trying to bench to failure twice a week, and while my numbers really went up, I started running into aches and pains in my pec tendons. I ignored this for a long time and kept pushing through the pain. Eventually, I actually developed a bit of a chronic overuse injury in my pec tendons, which still bothers me now when I try to bench. So this probably is one of the worst mistakes you can make because it can lead to chronic problems down the line. A lot of the other issues on this list you can fix later. The key is knowing when to change things up and when to back off with your training if you think you may be doing too much and causing these aches and pains. Recovery is key to bodybuilding, and this is a big mistake I made early in my training career, was not deloading properly. As I mentioned, I went through this phase when I was really pushing my bench and I was running into these pec issues. If I understood fatigue management and was able to deload when needed, I could have avoided those problems. Think of taking a deload when you start seeing signs of overreaching. These signs could include the fact that you're not progressing and you don't feel like you're recovering, you have decreased motivation to train, you're tired all the time, or if you're running into chronic aches and pains. Once you start seeing multiple of those signs, you really want to think about taking an easy week. The way I like to deload is to drop volume to about half or to maintenance volumes if you know what those are, and they're even lower than that. And then also back off on the RIR. So I normally train to 1 to 2 reps in reserve and train to failure on my last set for each muscle group in the workout. But during a deload, I might back off to more like 4 or 5 RIR. I recommend deloading every 4 to 12 weeks depending on your level of experience, as well as how rigorous your training program is. For example, if you're less experienced and you're not training with a very intense program, say you're only in the gym 3 days per week, you might be on the longer end of things. For myself, I'm training quite intensely these days, and I tend to accumulate a lot of fatigue quickly, so I deload every 4th week. Now, if you don't necessarily need deloads, don't feel like you have to take them. Say if you're only training 2 or 3 times per week. For example, if you're only training a couple times a week, you may not really need to deload at all, just because you're not accumulating enough fatigue from week to week to actually need a full week of easy training. So don't use these tips as excuses to just take it easy. Bodybuilding is tough and muscle doesn't come without hard work. But if you're like me or like a lot of other bodybuilders and you like taking things all the way to the extreme, then you will want to take some words of wisdom from this and be careful. A bodybuilding mistake I made early on was doing too much cardio. I used to run varsity track for my university, and I held on to running track even in the first year of med school, even though at that point my priorities were really starting to shift to the gym. We were running hard intervals on the track 5 times a week, and when you're doing that much cardio, you just don't have enough recovery resources around to really build muscle. And I found that when I quit track in my second year of med school and really devoted myself to bodybuilding, that I saw another big spike in gains that were just like my newbie gains. Now this carries over to other forms of cardio as well. So for example, if you like doing a lot of long runs, long bike rides, or you play some other sport, you do want to keep in mind that at some point, if you do too much cardio, it can have an interference effect with hypertrophy. This is both from the recovery standpoint and from a signaling aspect. Basically, you're trying to signal to your body to develop 2 different systems, and you can actually downplay your body's hypertrophy response. This isn't such a big issue for beginners since they're so sensitive to the training stimulus, but as you become more advanced, you do want to be a bit more careful with the cardio you're doing. And you also want to think about the intensity of your cardio. The more intense your cardio is, the more it's going to interfere with hypertrophy. So what I was doing all out track sprints was pretty bad. But for example, if your cardio is walking, it won't be as much of a problem. One of the main diet mistakes I made that I actually regret is dirty bulking. During my first 6 months of lifting coming out of high school, I remember putting on 20 pounds over about 6 months. And later on when I was an intermediate, I tried another dirty bulk where I basically did the same thing. And both times I ended up putting on a lot of excess fat, more so the second time because I didn't have those newbie gains. You do want to be careful with your bulking because there's a maximum rate at which your body is able to build muscle, and beyond that, added weight is going to be fat. The problem with dirty bulking is the opportunity cost. At some point, you're going to have to spend time cutting to lose that fat later down the line, and cutting is basically unproductive time. Your body is much better at building muscle when you're in a calorie surplus, so you really want to minimize the amount of time you spend in a calorie deficit. There are a couple of reasons why people think dirty bulking is better. First of all, you look bigger in clothes quickly. The problem is the fat you're putting on does get distributed all over your body, so it does make you look like your arms and your chest and your back are getting bigger. But just because you gain an inch on your arms doesn't mean that was all muscle. So for example, this might fool someone into thinking that they put on 20 pounds of muscle when maybe it was only like 5 or 6 pounds. The other thing is people will feel that they're getting a lot stronger during their dirty bulking phase. Some of this is going to be true progress because your body is better at building in a surplus, but some of this is also from added leverages from extra fat in your body. I had Jim Wendler on my podcast this morning and he talked about how elite strength athletes, for example, people squatting 1,000 pounds, actually get a big advantage of having big waists because they're able to bounce off of their waist in the whole of the squat. This actually applies to a lot of other muscle groups as well. For example, with the bench press, when you have more chest and back fat, you're actually reducing the range of motion you need to travel. So these exercises actually become easier and your numbers go up, but these numbers are inflated disproportionately to the amount of muscle you're putting on. And when you go through a cutting phase later on, some of that added strength will go away. So one advanced tip in this regard is to compare your lifting PRs to other points in time when you were at the same body fat percentage. This will make sure that you're actually seeing true progress. Here's a big mistake a lot of bodybuilders make that is an epidemic across the world, and that is having an irregular sleep schedule. In the book Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker, who is a leading sleep researcher, talks about the importance of having an even sleep schedule. When you get up and go to sleep at the same time every day, your body gets acclimatized to that schedule and you're able to fall asleep more easily and have more restful sleep throughout the night. A lot of people will party on the weekends, sleep in really late, and then have to get up for work on Monday. A key point though is that your body can't actually completely regain the sleep that you've lost throughout the week by sleeping in. I actually think that optimizing your sleep is critical for bodybuilding. I like to get you to think of your body as a laboratory, and you really want to optimize all of the variables in that laboratory for the experiment to succeed. This is something that I've struggled with for a long time, obviously, as a doctor. I still need to work overnight and do 24-hour shifts, and there's no way to get around it. But I can very clearly see that this has taken a toll on my gains. So try to even out your sleep schedule, and if possible, try and get enough sleep in on the weekdays. This will probably mean going to sleep a little bit earlier. To help regulate your sleep schedule, a sneaky trick is to play with your use of light. Having a lot of blue light around will tell your body that it's daytime and suppress melatonin. So you want to avoid blue light in the few hours before bed. There are blue light blocking apps and programs that you can use on your devices. And something that I've started doing is that I'll take a really bright light. I actually use a seasonal affective disorder lamp, and then I'll turn that on first thing in the morning. This is a great option for people who live in more northern latitudes like myself in Canada, where it's not always bright early in the morning year round. Obviously, ideally you would get sunlight first thing in the morning, and this will jumpstart your day, tell your body that it's time to be awake, and it's actually great because it cuts through that morning sleepy fog. Then when it comes to nighttime, your body's gonna be more likely to understand that it's time to sleep. One of the mistakes I made early in my training career was ignoring isolation work. Obviously, there's a flip side to this problem where people try and just do only isolation work. As a beginner, you really want to be focusing on main heavy compound movements, but isolation work does have its role. When you understand your training anatomy, you'll realize that there are certain movements that you really do want to try and include in your program. For example, when training the quads, squats don't fully train the quadriceps because one of the muscles, the rectus femoris, actually gets detension when you go down in a squat. So having a leg extension in your program will help to build your rectus femoris. Also with hamstring curls, one of the parts of one of your hamstring muscles, the short head of the biceps femoris, only gets trained when you flex your knee. So that means you ideally want to include a leg curl in your training program for full development. Now, if you're really short on time, like you're only training twice per week, I do recommend going for those main heavy compounds and really focusing on squats, hip hinges, presses, and pulling movements. But if you have enough time to get into the gym and really want to optimize your physique, you do want to include some isolation work intelligently. Obviously, you can look to any of my free programs on YouTube for inspiration. Now, one of the reasons why people ignore isolation work is because they end up putting compound movements on a pedestal. Obviously, they are very important, but you can overdo this. For example, getting married to the big three. This is a mistake a lot of lifters make, where they get into the squat, bench, and deadlift, and they think these movements are the holy grail of lifting. I think these movements are great for lifters and can build a lot of strength and hypertrophy, but they may not be the best movements for you, and you do want to have some variation in your bodybuilding program. I've run into problems with my patellar tendons because I was doing too many squats, and I could have gotten around this by switching things up in my program. But as a beginner and intermediate, I felt that squats were the king of exercises, and I always needed to have them in my programs. Remember that there are lots of different variations to squat type movements, and you ideally want to have a pool of your favorite exercises that work well for you that you can rotate in when a certain exercise gets stale. One of the disadvantages of the big three, the squat, bench, and deadlift, is that they are very fatiguing. Heavy barbell movements, especially when you get strong as an advanced athlete, generate a lot of fatigue that your body has to recover from. And since your body has a finite amount of recovery resources, if you tap these out early with these big heavy movements, you won't have as much energy to devote to the rest of your training volume, and thus you may not accumulate as much stimulus overall. So remember, you do want to switch things up from time to time, especially if you're feeling stale or if you're getting aches and pains. This is a mistake I made as an intermediate athlete, and that was not continuing to work on your technique. Most people understand that they need to learn how to execute lifts properly when they start lifting, but once you get the basics down, it can be easy to stop working on your technique and making things better. But you will find that as you become more advanced, you will unlock new levels of technique development. For example, improving your mind-muscle connection and being able to transfer technique cues to different exercises. So remember, there are levels to technique development, and you can continue to improve it even into your advanced years. One of the pitfalls a lot of bodybuilders make when they get into training is trying to progress too quickly. People might start a linear program and try to add weight every workout. This can be great for a true novice, but if you try and do that all the time, you're eventually going to stall. The best way to progress is to choose a progression method that allows you to progress at the fastest rate possible in a sustainable manner. What that means is you want to be able to continue running that progression for months on end. People often ask me about what's the best method for progression: linear progression, double progression, wave loading progression, or triple progression. And the answer is it will depend on you and where you are in your experience level, as well as the lift you're using. But if you find yourself trying to add weight and stalling out every few weeks, it means you're trying to progress too aggressively. Back off and try using a slower progression method that will allow you to continue the gains for longer. So those were my 10 bodybuilding mistakes. What's the biggest mistake that you made when you started lifting? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to hear about my favorite exercises for muscle growth, check out this video where I discuss with Yanis, who's a Greek YouTuber, about our favorite hypertrophy exercises for every main muscle group. Make sure you don't miss out on knowledge gains by subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you next time.